In January of 1832, 21 fur trappers were camped in the Laramie Valley of present-day Wyoming. The snow was 3 feet deep. The temperature dropped to -40, the point where exposed skin freezes in under 10 minutes and the moisture in your breath crystallizes before it leaves your face. These men slept outside on frozen ground, under open sky, for months at a time. But they didn't just survive, they slept comfortably. So how did mountain men sleep through winters that would kill an unprepared person in a single night? One of those trappers was a 22-year-old named Zenas Leonard. He and his party had ridden into the Laramie Valley expecting a short trapping season before heading back downstream. Instead, early snow trapped them for the entire winter on the open plains. Leonard later wrote about those months with a level of detail that surprises anyone who reads it today, because he didn't describe suffering. He described routine, hunting buffalo in deep snow, gathering firewood, and making camp each evening with the practiced efficiency of men who had done it hundreds of times before. These men had systems, techniques, and materials that modern outdoor enthusiasts would struggle to replicate, even with a trip to the best camping store in the country. The answer to how they did it involves every layer between their bodies and the frozen earth, every piece of animal hide wrapped around them, and a set of skills borrowed from people who had survived those mountains for thousands of years before any European trapper set foot in the Rockies. Between roughly 1810 and 1840, about 3,000 men roamed the Rocky Mountains trapping beaver. Beaver fur was used to make felt hats that were wildly popular in the eastern United States and across Europe. A single prime beaver pelt could fetch $6 to $8 at the annual summer rendezvous, and a skilled trapper could collect hundreds in a season. The men who did this work became some of the most capable wilderness survivors in American history. Names like Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, Jedediah Smith, Kit Carson, and John Coulter are still known today. Bridger spent nearly his entire adult life in the mountains, from the time he joined William Ashley's Upper Missouri Expedition in 1822 at the age of 18 until his later years as an Army scout and guide. He attended all 16 of the annual mountain rendezvous gatherings between 1825 and 1840. His knowledge of the Rocky Mountain terrain was so detailed that he could draw accurate maps of the region entirely from memory. These men trapped in small parties during the spring and fall, setting steel traps along streams and creeks. But when winter arrived, trapping season ended. The creeks froze, the beaver went deep into their lodges, and the mountain men settled into winter camps that could last from November through March, sometimes longer. And that's where the sleeping problem had to be solved, not for a single night, but for months on end. The first survival decision happened before anyone lay down to sleep. Choosing the right location for a winter camp was itself a critical skill, and experienced trappers were ruthlessly specific about it. They avoided ridgetops, where wind exposure could overwhelm even a good shelter system. They also stayed off valley floors, where cold air pools and settles during the night like water filling a basin. The ideal campsite sat on a sheltered bench or slope partway up a hillside, tucked behind a natural windbreak of dense timber. Cottonwood groves along river bottoms were especially favored because cottonwood bark could supplement horse feed during the months when grass was buried under snow and the trees provided fuel and wind protection. But here's a detail that most modern campers would never think about. Experienced mountain men oriented their shelters to face east or southeast so that the first rays of morning sunlight would warm them as the fire burned low in the hours before dawn. That wasn't about comfort, it was calculated heat management. The coldest part of any winter night is the hour just before sunrise, and the morning sun arriving at exactly that moment could mean the difference between sleeping through and waking up shivering. With the campsite chosen, the first thing any mountain man addressed was the ground beneath him. This is where most people get winter sleeping wrong, even today. You can pile every blanket you own on top of yourself, but if you're lying directly on frozen earth, the ground will pull the warmth right out of your body through conduction. Modern research confirms what these men knew from hard experience. Up to 80% of body heat can be lost through direct contact with cold ground. The solution was the bough bed. Mountain men would cut armloads of spruce, fir, or pine branches and lay them in thick layers between two retaining logs. The key was thickness. You needed enough boughs piled up so that when you lay down and your weight compressed the pile, you were still at least 6 inches off the frozen ground or snow surface. The branches trapped pockets of dead air between the needles, and that trapped air acted as insulation. Fir boughs were preferred because their needles were softer and more. Spruce worked, but the needles were sharper and less comfortable. Pine was somewhere in between. For camps that would be used for weeks or months, the men built more elaborate raised platforms. Two logs placed parallel with cross pieces lashed between them created a bed frame a foot or more off the ground. The frame was then filled with boughs, dried grasses, or whatever vegetation could be gathered. That extra air gap underneath the platform made an enormous difference on the coldest nights. Building it took time, but when you're going to sleep in the same spot for 3 months, every hour invested in a proper bed pays for itself, night after night, but insulating from the ground only solved half the problem. Above the bough bed came the shelter, and the mountain man's shelter of choice tells you everything about how these men prioritized warmth. They didn't build enclosed log cabins. They built lean-tos that were open on one side, and that open side always faced the fire. A typical winter lean-to was built by propping a long ridgepole between two trees, then leaning shorter poles against it at a steep angle, roughly 60 to 70 degrees. These poles were covered with layers of spruce boughs, bark, and sometimes animal hides or canvas for the men who could afford it. The steep angle was critical because it shed snow and rain, while also reflecting heat from the fire back down onto the sleeper. Think of it as a sloped wall that acts like a heat mirror. Chas Rauch, a modern practitioner of historical mountain man skills and a park ranger at Pioneer Trail State Park in Utah, described the setup this way. The mountain man slept fully clothed, hopefully with a full stomach and a warm hat on, wrapped in furs and wool blankets. Over his head might be a canvas or skin shelter, usually open to the fire. Few mountain men ever built log cabins. The most ambitious dwelling might have been a lean-to made of boughs and limbs covered with skins, blankets, or canvas. Now, if you're thinking that an open front shelter in -40 sounds like a terrible idea, that's the part that most people get wrong. The open front wasn't a design flaw, it was the entire point. Because directly in front of that opening, 4 to 6 feet away, burned the fire. And not just any fire. Mountain men used what's called a long log fire. Two large logs, each as long as a man is tall, placed parallel to each other with the fire burning between them. The logs acted as both fuel and reflector. As the fire consumed the inner faces of the logs, it burned slowly and steadily through the night, throwing consistent heat toward the lean-to opening. A well-built long log fire could burn for 8 to 10 hours without anyone adding fuel. The selection of wood mattered enormously. Green logs burned slower and lasted longer than dry ones. Hardwoods like oak or maple threw more heat per pound, but in the Rockies, men often worked with whatever was available. Cottonwood, pine, and spruce were common fuel sources. The trick was using the driest, most resinous wood for kindling and fire starting, then feeding in larger green logs once the fire was established and hot. A deep bed of coals underneath the big logs kept the whole system burning steadily, even when fresh snow fell on the fire during the night. In larger winter camps, fire tending was a shared responsibility. Men took turns through the night, waking every few hours to push the long logs closer together as they burned down, or to add new fuel. Frank Bird Linderman, who lived as a free trapper in Montana in the 1880s near the end of the fur trade era, wrote about camping beneath old spruce trees on snowshoes during winter trapping expeditions. He noted that he and his companions never suffered and were always healthy and strong. That kind of testimonial, decades into a life spent sleeping outdoors in Rocky Mountain winters, tells you just how well the system worked when practiced by experienced men. Behind the fire, many camps included a reflector wall. This was a simple stack of green logs, or sometimes a large rock face, positioned to bounce heat that would otherwise escape into the night air back toward the shelter and the sleeping men. Some trappers deliberately chose campsites next to natural rock outcrops or cliff faces for exactly this reason. The stone absorbed heat during the evening and radiated it back slowly through the night, acting like a natural thermal battery. The geometry of the entire setup was deliberate. The lean-to caught and held heat from above. The fire reflector pushed it back from the far side. The bough bed insulated from below. The sleeper was essentially enclosed in a pocket of radiant warmth, with only the sides exposed, and men often slept in a semicircle around a shared fire to close even those gaps. Body heat from the man next to you became part of the system. Nobody slept alone if they could help it. But all of that only worked if you had the materials and the time to build it. Take those away, and the Rocky Mountain winter turned into a death sentence almost overnight. Hugh Glass learned that firsthand. In 1823, near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, Glass was attacked by a grizzly bear during a fur trading expedition. The mauling was so severe that his companions, including a young Jim Bridger, assumed he would die within hours. They took his rifle, his knife, and his fire-making kit, and they left him behind on the banks of the river. Glass didn't die. He somehow survived the mauling, set his own broken leg, and dragged himself 200 miles to Fort Kiowa over the course of several weeks. Then he spent the following winter traveling alone through the frozen landscape of present-day Montana and Wyoming, tracking down the men who had abandoned him. He survived nights in the open with no shelter waiting for him, no fire kit in his pocket, and no buffalo robe rolled up on his horse. Just the knowledge in his head and whatever the landscape provided. That required mastery of every technique we've been talking about, executed perfectly, night after night, in conditions that most people today would consider unsurvivable. Glass eventually forgave young Bridger, recognizing that the 18-year-old had been pressured by an older man named John Fitzgerald. But his story shows exactly how thin the line was between survival and death in the Rocky Mountain winter. The system worked, but only if you knew how to build it, and only if you had the discipline to do it right every single night. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I cover survival history and lost skills from the American frontier every week. Now back to the men who had the full system in place. On top of that bough bed, the mountain man had his bedding. And this is where the buffalo robe enters the picture. A winter-harvested buffalo robe was one of the most effective pieces of cold-weather sleeping gear ever used in North America. Only hides taken between November and March, when the fur was in its prime, were suitable for robes. The thick, dense underfur of a winter buffalo hide created an insulating layer that modern synthetic materials still struggle to match pound for pound. A single winter-weight buffalo robe could weigh over 20 pounds and measure roughly 7 feet by 5 feet, large enough to wrap completely around a grown man. Native Americans had been using buffalo robes as primary cold-weather bedding for generations before any European trapper arrived in the Rockies. Mountain men adopted the practice quickly, and a good buffalo robe became one of the most prized possessions in any trapper's outfit. Some men slept wrapped in a single robe laid fur side in against the body, with a wool trade blanket as an outer layer. Others used two robes, one beneath them on top of the bough bed and one on top as a blanket. The wool trade blanket was the other critical piece. Hudson's Bay Company point blankets and similar trade goods were thick, tightly woven, and retained much of their insulating ability even when damp. For mountain men, wool's ability to keep you warm when wet wasn't an interesting piece of trivia. It was the difference between a cold night and a dangerous one. Sweat, snowmelt, and condensation were constant threats to bedding in winter camps, and wool was the only widely available material that could handle moisture without becoming dangerously cold against the skin. A typical mountain man's sleeping kit was a buffalo robe, two 3.5-point wool blankets, and the clothes on his back. He slept in everything he wore during the day: multiple shirts, sometimes with long tails that came down to mid-thigh, a leather jacket shirt over those, a heavy wool or leather outer coat, wool or leather leggings wrapped from ankle to knee, leather boots stuffed with fur or dry grass for insulation, a wool stocking cap or fur cap made from beaver or other pelts, leather mittens, and sometimes a wool neckerchief wrapped around the ears and lower face to block the wind. The layering principle that modern outdoor clothing companies spend millions marketing as cutting-edge technology was standard practice on the frontier 200 years ago. Each layer traps a thin film of warm air, and stacking multiple layers creates a cumulative insulating barrier that no single thick garment can match. The mountain man figured that out through trial and freezing error long before anyone put a brand name on it. But all the shelter, bedding, and clothing in the world couldn't keep you warm if your body wasn't producing enough heat to begin with. And this brings up something that modern campers rarely consider. What you eat before you sleep matters just as much as what you sleep under. Mountain men ate enormous quantities of high-fat, high-protein food during winter months. Their diet was dominated by buffalo meat, elk, deer, and other wild game, often consumed in amounts that would shock a modern nutritionist. Trappers have been recorded eating 8 to 10 pounds of meat in a single day during peak winter conditions. The body needs fuel to generate heat, and in -40, caloric demands skyrocket. Fat in particular produces more than twice the energy per gram compared to carbohydrates or protein, making it the ideal fuel for sustained body heat through a long, cold night. Pemmican was the concentrated version of this principle, made from dried, pulverized lean meat mixed with equal parts rendered animal fat, sometimes with dried berries added. Pemmican was one of the most calorie-dense foods ever developed. A single 2-ounce portion packed nearly 300 calories, almost 80% of which came from fat. It could last for months without refrigeration, was lightweight relative to its caloric value, and provided slow-burning energy that kept the body's internal furnace running through the night. Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains had perfected pemmican over centuries, and it became essential to the fur trade. Going to bed on a full stomach loaded with fat and protein meant the body had fuel to burn all night. A mountain man who ate well before turning in would generate enough metabolic heat to warm the air inside his buffalo robe and wool blankets, creating a personal microclimate that could stay surprisingly comfortable even when the temperature outside was brutal. And this brings up the thread that ties the entire sleeping system together. Nearly every one of these techniques, from the bough bed to the lean-to shelter to the buffalo robe to pemmican, was learned from indigenous peoples. The mountain men didn't invent cold weather survival in the Rockies. They borrowed it from communities that had been thriving in these mountains for thousands of years. Many trappers lived with Native American communities for extended periods. A significant number married indigenous women, and those partnerships were far more than personal. They were educational. The skills of Native American women made them invaluable partners in wilderness life. They could handle horses, make and break camp efficiently, construct and repair clothing, prepare food for preservation, and build shelters suited to local conditions. When a trapper married into a community, he gained not just a partner, but access to generations of accumulated survival knowledge. Jim Bridger himself married 3 times, first to a Flathead woman, then to a Shoshone woman, then to a third wife from another tribe. He spoke multiple indigenous languages conversationally. The survival skills he became famous for weren't things he invented in isolation. They were techniques absorbed through decades of close contact with people who had mastered their environment long before the fur trade existed. Modern outdoor recreation companies now spend millions developing insulation technologies, layering systems, and shelter designs that often end up replicating principles these communities perfected centuries ago. The R-value rating on your sleeping pad? Mountain men solved that problem with spruce boughs. The draft collar on your sleeping bag? They wrapped a wool neckerchief around their face. The vestibule on your tent? They positioned a fire reflector wall. Try finding a modern product that wasn't already figured out with animal hides and tree branches 200 years ago. The difference is that mountain men couldn't afford to get it wrong. There was no rescue helicopter, no emergency beacon, no warm truck parked a mile away. If your system failed at -40 in the Laramie Valley in 1832, you froze to death. The fact that men like Zenas Leonard and Jim Bridger survived not just one winter but decades of winters tells you everything about how effective these techniques actually were. Bridger lived to be 77 years old. He spent the better part of 5 decades in the Rocky Mountains. He didn't survive on luck. He survived because the sleeping system worked. The bough bed stopped the ground from stealing his heat. The lean-to with the fire reflector created a warm pocket around him. The buffalo robe and wool blankets trapped his body heat. The high-fat meal before bed kept his internal furnace burning through the night. And every single one of those elements came from paying attention to people who already knew the answers. I cover survival history and lost skills from the American frontier every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Next time you crawl into your $300 sleeping bag rated to -20, think about the men who did it with a buffalo hide, 2 wool blankets, and a pile of spruce branches. They slept just fine.